Welcome to the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I'm your host, Jacob Cooper, best-selling author of Life After Breath and the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. For those of you who are new to my channel, we'd love having you here. Please check out other videos and make sure you hit that subscribe button as well as bell notification icon to get up to date to interviews coming your way each and every week. Today's interview and guest is Dr. Raymond Moody. For those of you who don't know Raymond Moody, he coined the term the near-death experience in the mid-70s in his bestseller, Life After Life, and he's got a new book that just came out, which I was gladly endorsed, called Proof of Life After Life. So Raymond's going to be talking about his new upcoming book, as well as his journey to really research and study the credibility of near-death experiences. And he's just a brilliant, amazing guy and a dear friend. So without further ado, we bring Dr. Raymond Moody on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Dr. Raymond Moody, it is my honor to have you here as my guest on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I know I wouldn't have my channel without you, your body of work, and our continual friendship. But thank you so much for coming on. How have you been, since we last spoke? How's things been?
Jacob, how long ago was it we last spoke? Well, a year or two?
Well, time goes by fast. A couple
Yeah.
months ago, I know we connected. I
Yeah,
think we were about to go to New York City for some
that's
type
right.
of
That's
conference.
right. I remember our
Yeah.
first time was about 2 years ago, right? I think.
Like
I'm
a
just
year ago. For viewers, it was interesting. I was doing a past life regression, and right before the regression, I'm looking at my phone, and it says Dr. Raymond Moody, and I said, that's a synchronicity. We're talking about reincarnation, past lives, which hopefully we'll get into in our conversation today, as well as your beautiful book that you've written with Paul Perry, Proof of Life After Life, which has just come out, and I'm proud to endorse your newest work.
thank you so
But
much.
otherwise, how have you been since our last conversation? What's been new with Dr. Moody?
I'm 79 years old and have never been afraid of aging because I was raised by old people in World War II, and I'm just really pleased that I spent a year as a geriatric psychiatrist, and for the VIPs in town, it's the place where the mayor and the police chief could go and all. And during that time, I heard constantly, Jacob, these very reflective, accomplished old people would say, Raymond, the older I get, the more that when I look back at my life, I have the uncanny impression that it's been a movie or a novel or a script or a story or a play, a drama. They use different words, but the idea is the same. And, that's really emerging with me. And I see, as you and I both know, one of the big problems surrounding the afterlife is what is it that survives? What is the nature of the, the entity or whatever that survives death? And, soul, I mean, that feels not soulful for people, but what does the word mean? Where I have come on the personal identity question is I think that each person is that person's story. And I am, my identity is the story of Raymond Moody. It's interesting that cinematographers have what they call the Kulikov effect, which is that if you put any two random objects, like a tube of face cream and a cup, um, and just put them in sequence and present them to people, the mind automatically starts spinning a story to connect the things. And consciousness itself is narrative. So to make my, to say in terms of what we were talking about, I'm doing really good because physically, maybe not the best. I get out and walk every day, but I'm just really fascinated with the life development. And another thing, you will appreciate this, Jacob, because you learned this. I mean, you're just in a way that I don't know how you did it, but you know, um, that phrase, the happiest life is a life of service to others. See,
Mm.
when I was a kid, I heard that as an ideal. Then you get into midlife and you begin to hear it as an aspiration. But by the time you're 79, it's just a fact of experience because you realize that whenever you're out for yourself and you're thinking about yourself, you're always miserable. It's only when you turn your attention away from all that to help other people that
Mhm.
you become happy. So
Right.
that's where I am. And my take on you, by the way, is that you got to that point a long time before I did.
Well, I don't know. You just ask your loved ones and they'll humble you in a second, but I do the best that I can. That's a Ram Dass quote. It says, "You think you're good, just ask the people around you. They'll tell you the real." No. You know what I say about you is so true because you were quite comfortable, I'm sure, and we could talk a little bit about your background professionally and working in the confines of academia, but you went out on a limb in
Yeah.
exploring the work that you did, and I'm sure that had its bumps, but it was about something that was calling you. It was about service, and I know
Yeah.
so many you've literally changed the world by being able to act on a calling and getting a little bit out of your comfort zone to be of service to this calling. But could you tell us a little bit about that journey, how it started, how you're able to transform, from a clinical psychiatrist to a doctor in philosophy to now this guy that we associate with the afterlife? How did this all come into the fold? And the same feelings that you have towards me, I have towards you, my man, times 1,000. So I'm just a reflection of the beauty that you are.
Thank you. And it's the way it happened, Jacob, is I fortunately for me, and unfortunately for my dad, he was a medic in World War II in the Pacific Theater.
Well,
Okay,
my
so
grandfather was too. Battle of the Bulge in France.
oh wow, okay. Now that generation, as you know, they didn't talk about these things.
Mm, mm,
But to me, as I see in retrospect, when I was a kid, my dad was very hostile and sarcastic toward
mm.
religion. And
Wow.
I didn't, to me, it was just part of the scenery. I didn't think about it because I was focused on my telescope. I was
Mm,
a fanatical amateur astronomer from the age of 7 and still am fascinated. Okay. And that was, I remember looking through the telescope at age 7 or 8 was when I woke up to the fact that this life we're in is incomprehensible.
mm,
Right? Because you want to know how big is this thing? Your mind goes out to the wall. Just a minute. Doesn't there have to be something on the other side of the wall? But if it goes on forever, that doesn't make sense either. Now, concurrently, that didn't scare me or discomfort me at all. To me, it was really great adventure because at that same time, my favorite authors, Jacob, were Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll. And this was before the Cat in the Hat. I remember going down to the bookstore and I heard out Cat in the Hat came out. What? I'm more into Horton Hears the Who and the Thidwick the Big Hearted Moose, the really surrealistic
mm.
ones. And
Interesting.
so, yeah, and so I realized that what Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll were all about, which is nonsense or unintelligibility, is a characteristic of this whole thing that we're in. And that was the thing that got me started on my life quest. I went to UVA at age 18 to study astronomy, took a philosophy course because I'd been interested in philosophy in high school, and I was hooked the first day. First day I said, I'm going to be a philosophy major.
Mm,
And what this book, The Republic,
mm,
Jacob, which that Plato's Republic, that probably hits with a dull thud with most people.
mm,
But what the Republic is all about is the question of justice vis-a-vis the question of life after death. That's what
mm.
it's all about. It
Wow.
begins with this notion of an elderly man. And you know a lot of people like this, and I do too. It's like been in their business very successfully, doing great all their life. Then they
Mm,
get to be 60, 70, and it's like, as the character at the beginning of Plato's Republic said, he said, I spent all my life in my business. I'm elderly now, done very well. But recently these stories I heard as a kid about the afterlife come bubbling
mm.
back. And that's a very common thing. And so I was just fascinated by this book, and by it comes to this big dramatic crescendo in the story of a warrior who was believed dead on the battlefield, who revived during his funeral and told about. He said, "I got out of my body and I went through a passageway into another world," and that to me was a shocker. I remember when I read that, I'm like, "What?" And it was like,
This is right? You're
"Er,
talking? Yes.
right." And so I asked my Professor Hammond, I said, "Professor Hammond, what's this all about?" And he said, "Well, early Greek philosophers studied these cases of people who were apparently dead but revived and had experiences." And Professor Hammond told me that just about the same time, or a little earlier than Plato, Democritus, who had just figured out by reason alone that things are made of tiny little bits that you can't see,
Mm.
wrote about this, and he said there's no such thing as a moment of death. He said that what this experience represents is the residual biological activity in the body even after it appears dead. Now,
Mm.
isn't it interesting that we still have that same debate going 2,300 years later? Today, we call it oxygen deprivation to the brain,
Mm.
but it's the same debate. Now, at that time, I was fascinated, but it never entered my mind that that might still be something in the modern world.
Mm.
In 1965, I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at UVA, who had had such an experience when he was 20 years old.
Mm.
And he talked to student groups about it. I went and I was blown away because I knew that George Ritchie was real. He was such an impressive. I had no idea what to make about this experience, except that he obviously, it changed his life, and obviously it was the same thing the Greeks were talking about. So that was the point where I got hooked, and then I just over the next few years just interviewed lots and lots of people. Went to medical school. Went to as a professor of philosophy for a while. Heard this from my students and my colleagues, and then went to medical school. So
Mm.
that's how it evolved, and it's been a very long process for me, Jacob, because not having any template.
Mm.
I mean, when I went off to college, I thought that the idea of an afterlife, literally, I thought it was a premise of New Yorker cartoons, which was how
Mm.
I had been exposed to it, or a um, Jack Benny movie. When I was a kid, that my aunt Edna took me to was
Mm.
about the afterlife and angels or something, and that was my exposure. What little religion I had was from and it wasn't really religion, but my aunt Ruth was Jewish, and she was the only person in the family who had any sort of interest in that. And she, I think probably had a lot to do in shaping my spirituality. She taught me this thing about always thank the animal when you're eating and all this stuff.
Mm.
But that was the basis of, I mean, I had no real, and Ruth never said anything about the afterlife. I mean, to me, it was just a big surprise. And so it's taken me a long time to get to where I am now. I never fell for that thing about, oh, this is oxygen deprivation to the brain for
Mm.
two reasons. The main one is philosophical, which is that theory, oh, this is caused by the oxygen deprivation. That is an outcome of a philosophical view of the mind body relationship, which is called epiphenomenalism. And
Mm.
epiphenomenalism holds that there is no independent reality to consciousness, but that consciousness is the secondary byproduct of what they regard as reality, which is the brain substance and the electrochemical reactions. But I mean, that's just an incoherent doctrine to me, so I never took that seriously. But
Mm.
also, during my first year of medical school, um, um, the one of my own professors, who became later my professor of psychiatry, approached me in the bookstore. I remember at that time they had what they called a Facebook, which was just the photographs of the new
Mm.
students who came in. So she recognized me from the Facebook. And she said, Dr. Moody, she said, introduce yourself. I've been wanting to talk to you about some mentation I had when I was trying to resuscitate my mother.
Hmm.
And she said, you got out of her body. She looked down. She saw the scene from above, saw her mother's now deceased body,
Hmm.
saw her mother there in spirit form, as she said, saw her mother recede into this tunnel with apparitions of her mother's deceased friends and
Hmm.
relatives. And then she came back to her body. So obviously, you see, that's not oxygen deprivation to the brain. And
Hmm.
this is quite a common thing that people at the bedside who are not ill or injured have the same experience that when it occurs to somebody who gets resuscitated following a cardiac arrest, um, that they that the people standing around who are not themselves ill or injured nonetheless have all of these things that we think of as in your death experience. People say, as grandma died, I myself left it out of my body. I went
Hmm.
part toward her with this toward this light. I saw her relatives and friends coming forward. Then I came back to my body. Or people in the room say that the room changes confirmation. It's like you're in a non three
Hmm.
dimensional environment, or the room fills with light, or that you
Hmm.
see relatives and friends of the deceased person's dead relatives come
Hmm.
in. And most incredibly, Jacob, to me, this is the most uncomfortable thing I know in a while out of all the things I've studied, and that is that apparently it's common enough so that you can study it.
Hmm.
Cases of people at the bedside of the dying who, as the person dies, the bystanders themselves empathically co-live the dying life review of the person who's passing away, which is upsetting to me because I'm trying to get myself recused from my own life review. Much less have a spectator there is shocking. And yet, all of the people I've said it's a perfectly natural experience. And it occurs sometimes, and I have one case of this, of a physician who contacted my wife and me several years ago and was saying that he was called to the emergency room to resuscitate a patient he had never seen. And he said, as this guy was dying, the doctor himself experienced this man's life review. So something is going on here, you see, that is,
Would that be like a shared death
yeah, shared
experience,
death.
which certainly we'll get into. I wanted to just first of all reflect on one thing that you mentioned. I know in prior interviews, it seems like you really gravitate to this quote. I believe it's by Eli Wiesel that God created us because God loves stories. And when I'm
Yeah,
and I know that's a big quote of yours. And when I'm looking back on your life, and let's say I'm like reading a script, it seems like all right, guy with a medical background, philosophy background, people come to him with these things. It seems like something out of a movie where your, academic and personal and professional background just put you in the perfect position
it
to
did.
be where you are with the credibility and the vantage point to see this. Do you feel this was all in the playing in the way that the life that you lived and your prior chapters that you were writing prepared you for this incredible work that you've done the last several decades? Do you feel that that's a part of your play?
First of all, I want to apologize to our viewers and listeners about this next story, which is kind of, I hate to be autobiographical. I mean, I don't want to bore anybody,
We love hearing about you,
Oh,
Ray.
well, but this is
They
what
will too.
this is
Yeah.
what happened. The first living person I heard this from was from Dr. George Ritchie at the
Yeah.
University of Virginia,
Yeah.
who was from Richmond, Virginia.
Mm.
And my mom and dad were from Porterdale, Georgia.
Mm.
Okay, now George's experience took place at Camp Barkley, Texas in December 1943 when he was a recruit into World War II and getting ready to go to the Battle of the Bulge, by the way, which he did later. And George was fat. He developed double lobar pneumonia. He was dead, according to the doctor, for at least 9 minutes before they resuscitated him by injection adrenaline into his heart. Okay, and he had this amazing experience of leaving his body. Um, seeing his life reviewed by a compassionate, or just a panorama, seeing everything he'd ever done in the presence of a being of complete love and compassion that he identified as Christ, that some identify as God, or whatever. And so this amazing story, which blew me away when I heard it in 1965 when I was 20 years old. Um, and now, then, I finished my work at UVA and got a PhD in philosophy. Then I philosophy professor for 3 years. Then I went to medical school. And in 1974, I wrote my book, Life After Life, which was published in November of 75. And the first contact I had in all that time, since I saw Dr. Ritchie first, was in 1975. I called him and asked him if it's okay if I could dedicate my book to him. And he said, well, that's very nice. He said, but I would prefer you to dedicate this book to the Christ who gave me this experience. So that's the point of the dedication to In Life After Life, which reads, to George Ritchie, MD, and through him, the one whom he suggested. So the book was published in November of 75. I graduated from Medical College of Georgia in January of 76. And I decided to go back to the University of Virginia for my psychiatry residency. So in March of 76, we went up to Charlottesville so I could be interviewed for my residency appointment. And while there, just called up Dr. Ritchie. Hi, I just wanted to say hi. Oh, please come on over for dinner and all. That was the first time I'd seen him in 10 years or more. And so, next day, flew back to Macon, Georgia, where my parents lived. And so I just mentioned that evening to my dad that the previous day I had been with Dr. Ritchie, was the first living person I heard this from. By then, my dad had heard a tape of George Ritchie's experience. And this is what my dad said. He said, George Ritchie, Camp Barkley, Texas, December 1943. So it's very interesting. He said, I was there, and so were you. My mom and dad moved to Camp Barkley in early September 1943 so my dad could go to officers candidate school. I was conceived in late September. George's experience was December 24th, as I recall. My mom and dad moved away from Camp Barkley on December 29th. So I was there in utero when this. Now, this goes to your question of, do I think that there's some destiny or whatever you would call it, and it does seem so. And then back in
The fact that your parents knew George Ritchie and you.
Well, they didn't know him, but they were there at the time because my dad.
They were there. Oh, I see. Yes.
Yeah, my dad was there in officers candidate school, right where this event happened, and
insane.
Now, I was in 1964. I found this beautiful old gorgeous grist mill way out in the country, and I decided that I want to live in a place like that. I looked around for a few years. No, people who own grist mills, they don't want to sell them, right? So I'd sort of surrendered that as a fantasy. After about a year of looking around, I said, it's not possible. So I'd let that go. Now, in 1989, I was teaching psychology at West Georgia College, and I wanted to do this work on the psychomanteon, a way of evoking the spirits of the deceased. And I needed a place out of the country to do it, but I kept looking around the town where I was living. The prices were beyond reach. So the psychology department secretary one day said, Raymond, if you just go 11 miles across the state line to Alabama, the real estate over there, said, you'll be able to find a place out in the country you like. I have no sense of direction. I called up my friend who was a real estate agent in Georgia who was born in Alabama. Can you help me find a place in Alabama? Never any mention of an old mill. Okay. And I don't have any sense of direction. My only criterion was it had to be close enough to the state line where I could get back and forth for 3 days a week to do my teaching.
Mm.
Okay, so my friend picked me up in January of 1990, called me in the night before. You go to Alabama tomorrow? She didn't even say exactly where because she knows that I'm not good at directions. Next morning, she came, picked me up, took me to this Calhoun County, Alabama, as it was, and the reason she got that place was that the chief deputy sheriff there was a good friend of her son, and he had agreed to take us around. He'd read my book and so on. Now, I never said anything about Old Mill, but I found this little Victorian cottage with a for sale sign.
Mm.
Hey, I like that place. And the sheriff said, "Oh, Kirk Moore, the name of the agent on it. That's a friend of mine. Let's go see Kirk." So went to see Kirk. "Hi, I'm Raymond Moody. What are you looking for?" He said, "Well, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm looking for a place out in the country to do some research and writing." And I never said anything about exactly what.
Mm.
And so I was standing to the side. He looked up like this and said, "Let me take you by a place near where I live,
Mm.
down a road, across a bridge, to an old mill." I
Mm.
thought I was dreaming. And he said, "But the problem is it's not for sale." He said, "The reason I'm telling you about it is," he said, that the elderly couple who owned it had children who were raised and gone living downtown. And they were friends of Kirk Moore, the agent, and they were trying to get Kirk to kind of ease their parents out of this old gristmill. They were worried about them living so far out in the country by themselves. So that was why Kirk, and so he went back to his office because no cell phones then. In my presence, Ms. Dorr, this is Kirk Moore. Can I bring a man by to see your place? Yes, you can, Kirk. I heard that. We're not going to sell our house. And I figured, she was probably just thinking if somebody wanted to see the house because when I
Mm.
moved there, because people were always, "Can I come in and see?" So back to there, out of the car into the foyer, and I shook hands with Miss Dorr, who said, and I said, "I'm Raymond Moody." She said, Raymond Moody, are you the man that wrote that book?" And
Wow.
she took me to her bookshelf, and she got out George Ritchie's book,
Mm.
which had written the forward to it. And she opened it like this and showed me the inscription to them. And she said, "Well, Dr. George Ritchie is one of our dear, dear friends.
Wow.
This must be a sign." And George had been in that house many times.
Wow.
Now, you see, it's what do you make of that? I don't know, but
These seem like powerful. There's levels of synchronicities, and I know Dr. Gary Schwartz speaks heavily about this stuff,
mhm,
but he speaks, I think, like different levels of it. But this almost seems like super synchronicities, the
yeah,
probabilities of something happening and this connecting are like 0.001. It almost reminds me when I was just reading Kenneth Ring's book several years ago, and my father looks at the book much like your dad looked at you, and he looks down, he goes, "Kenneth Ring?" I go, "Yes." He was my psychology professor at the
wow,
University of Connecticut in the 60s. And I'm like, "Yeah, he goes, he's write books. I just knew him as a psychology professor." It was, so, and then years later, his kid, 50 years later, is reading his book, and it's just there's
yeah,
no time over there, and just the
I know.
connections from one thing to another thing within time, and it's just as if time. It's just sometimes you just shake your head and just say, "How could you not believe there's some orchestration
That's right.
happening on display?"
You're absolutely right. It's not possible not to be shaken and impressed by that kind of
Yeah,
event.
yeah. If you just take a step back and look at all the connected dots, it's incredible. But you certainly, and certainly in this book, Proof of Life After Life, that I loved and I endorsed. There's a lot of different stories because I think people need to really see these things. I'm amazed that people work in the medical field and somehow don't believe in something beyond this with the miracles that you're seeing, but that's neither here nor there. Now for you, you've mentioned a phenomenon that you were talking about called a shared death experience. And I
Hmm.
know in Proof of Life After Life, that's included in a lot of different anecdotal references. But I've heard you in interviews discuss this phenomenon as something that almost blows you away even more so in a sense than an NDE.
Yeah.
Can you explain why? And also, I wanted to just say thank you because we're going to be bringing on your co-author, Paul Perry, on in a little bit. But there was a video that you did that I constantly reference of you and Paul walking in the woods talking about shared death experiences. And that video has reached so many, including Elizabeth Boisson, right after her son crossed over. And that video influenced the life that she lives and all the souls that he touches. And it's just from a conversation, a walk in the woods, talking about these things. You just don't know who is listening, who is watching, and the trajectory of the ripple effect that you reach that one person in all the lights that they have lived. But could you talk a little bit about the shared death experience, how that differs from an NDE? Because I feel there's a lot of viewers who have had this and just don't know what exactly it is.
That's right. The near-death experience we know about is something that occurs to someone who almost dies, say in a cardiac arrest, but is revived.
Mm-hmm.
And they say things like, as I was dying, I got out of my body. I saw the scene from above. I went through a passageway into a bright light. I saw my relatives who had died were there to greet me. I saw my life in review. I came back to my body and was revived. And we all sort of know about that, but what is not really settled into the public consciousness yet is that identical phenomenon occurs not to somebody who almost dies and is revived, but rather to bystanders at the death of someone else, often a close relative, but not necessarily. But as the person in the bed dies, the bystanders themselves have elements of what we call these near-death experiences. The bystanders may say that the room brightens up, that you don't feel like you're in a 3D environment anymore, in some other kind of environment. They say that they see and perceive relatives or friends of the dying person's dead relatives come into the room and as though to escort them away. People at the bedside may say that as the person who's dying dies, that the bystanders themselves may feel they lift out of their body and they go upward toward this light with the dying person, and then at a certain point they come back and rejoin their bodies. And also, incredibly, Jacob, I have a lot of cases of people who empathically co-lived the dying life review of their relative or person who was dying. For years, I thought this could only be somebody who's very intimate with the person. But no, some years ago, my wife Cheryl and I got a email from a physician who I forgot a letter. He called us and he got in touch with me, and he said that he had been called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never seen, and that as this guy was dying, that the physician himself saw the dying patient's life review around him. And so that's what a shared death experience it is. It's essentially the same thing as that what we know, to be a near-death experience, except it occurs not to someone who's almost dying and revived, but rather to a bystander or person nearby who is not ill or injured, but just
and nothing happened to them physically at all. And I know some debunkers could say, oh, you had this chemically going on that, but if you're all totally, and that we could talk at another, but if you're all totally fine, like how does this happen? It's just, how do you explain that? And
yeah,
amazing. I know we have a friend, Dr. Sharon Prentice, who wrote Becoming Starlight. I know she introduced me to you, and she really someone who had a profound SDE, but they happen a lot more than you would think. I know, for instance, like my brother, who's a podiatrist, not so into this stuff, but he's a little open-minded, but he spoke about euthanizing our dog when it was her time. And he just said, like, he felt a lot of different things. And those to me are trickles of
Yeah.
droplets of an SDE.
Yeah.
Sometimes people have it more fully blown, but I think it's important for people to have an identification on their experiences and know the criteria. And you and Paul have laid that out. So I thank you. I want to say with the near-death experience, I wouldn't be talking about my near-death experience if there wasn't a terminology for it. I had it just as a 3-year-old boy, and I read Betty Adie's book, Embraced by the Light, and I just saw, wow, that this was a phenomenon. Something
Sure.
had this. And it's amazing when you have a diagnosis, whether it's through mental health or your experiences, and how transformative that you could be. What got you to the point of identifying NDE, SDE? Do you look back on it and say, I wish maybe there's another term for it, or you're cool with both of those terms? Like, how did you come up with those terminologies?
Well, when I was doing this initially back in the 60s and 70s, as you said, there wasn't a term.
Mm.
And, I got to say this, Jacob. You've probably heard, I just hear all the time, poor Dr. Moody, he was persecuted by the medical community. They thought he was nuts and all. And that makes a good story. And it
It's
makes me look like
clickbait,
a
right?
hero. But in fact, it never happened.
Mm.
It's by the time I went to medical school in '72, I had been studying this for about 10 years, and I had friends who were ahead of me in school or whatever, but I had known, and they had spread the word among the faculty at the medical school that in September, this PhD philosophy student was coming in to be a medical student who had studied these near death experiences. Within 2 weeks, I got to medical school, Jacob. 8 of my professors called and said, Dr. Moody, thank you for investigating this. It's like
Mm.
about half of them said, um, that I had it myself. The rest of them said they heard it from their patients and were curious. And
Mm.
so that never happened. The thing that makes me look hero. Actually, the gaff I got was from the fundamentalist community in Georgia, as you can imagine, because they found out about this, and this was to them of the devil. So that was the gaff I got, but certainly not from all religious people. It just depends on the particular. A lot of people in various religions were very accepting and interested in this. But I wasn't persecuted as much as
As
people
what a
would
lot. Yeah.
imagine.
It's interesting because they talk about the biggest psychological fears, and we do a lot of them, but the top two is usually death and public speaking, and we have like exposure therapy to a degree. But
Sure.
now what I'm seeing is more of a phenomenon of people having exposure therapy on death, where
Mm.
when you started, maybe there wasn't as much interest, but now you look at it, there's thousands of channels all talking about near-death
Yeah,
experiences.
yeah.
This phenomenon, what is going on? Like, it seems
What
like
is
there's like
going
this
on?
big explosion of interest on this stuff that, as you said, has been around for quite some time. Like, why is this all of a sudden just clicking and exploding right now? I'm just trying to understand that.
I think it's technological.
Hmm.
See, it's in the '60s and '70s when the CPR, the cardiopulmonary resuscitation techniques took
Hmm.
off. See, and by the time when I started studying this in the late '60s and into the early '70s, by then there were all of these many people who had had this cardiac arrest and been resuscitated from it. So that something that was formerly very, very rare, because it was very rare for somebody who almost died to be revived, suddenly now becomes a very common thing. And for example, when I was teaching philosophy, for example,
Hmm.
and I would talk to my students about these experiences. I heard them from my students, from my colleagues, and so then word spread around the town that this doctor is a philosophy professor studying these cases. Then, of course, the civic clubs, they have to have a speaker every Wednesday or Tuesday or whatever. And so then, as once you get invited to one civic club, then they all want to have you. And that was, and it turned out that was the ideal population for talking. These were, at that time, it was exclusively male province, kind of the hard driving movers and shakers in town, the top level businessmen and so on. So it would make sense, see, that these people were, would be the very people you would think might have had a cardiac arrest or something.
Right.
And I never went to one of those civic club meetings where at least one of them, 7 of the participants came up and said, Dr. Moody, I've never told anybody this, but. So you see, another thing is, I am not a brave person. And people say, oh, you were so brave to bring this out. But no, I had been studying it for 10 years. Let's see. Gosh, a long time before the book came out. And so I knew full well, just from my experience, that anybody who was in a position to do so, who wanted to check me out, could just ask around among their own patients and would quickly be satisfied that I was right. So it wasn't bravery. See, it was just, I fully understood that as soon as this came out, then people were going to be saying, yeah. And so that's what happened. But the problem I got was still from more like the conservative religionists.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because throughout time, it seems like people are afraid individually to come out with their own belief systems because that will go against the grain of a mechanized control, structure of religion. And when it comes to the afterlife, religion will feel like they have a monopolization on that so that they continue their control. And I think the viewpoint on God and the afterlife informs the life that we live. For instance, if God is a judgeful, angry, competitive God, then that's how you'll live your life. But if God is a loving, forgiving God, then that will inform your behavior. Yeah. So I think that's what near-death experiences can hopefully teach us, is a new relationship with the divine and a repaired relationship with divine if you've had a fractured dynamic through your religious or upbringing. I would hope.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think you're just, you're right on. And, in your sociology courses and all, with that kind of mindset. By the way, when I started my psychiatry residency, all the social workers I ever met said, Raymond, you should have gone into social work. That's what you're really interested in.
Yeah.
And I would go around with the social workers when they would visit the different chronic patients and all. And sociologically, you see, I think that when people say, I believe that such and such, what that is what I think we take that to be unreflectively is that when somebody says, I believe that such and such, I think that we assume that they're talking internally, right? To talk about an internal state. But if you just watch the behavior of those people, I believe that, that whatever it is, that is not a state of internal. It's a signal of coherence with your fellow believers is what it is. See, I think it's like somebody says, I believe that. It's like I'm aligned with this group of people over here in the church. It's not really internal. And so I think that, belief is, I was a professor of epistemology, it's like, I can't think of that sentence, I believe that such and such, apart from a whole raft of similar expressions with the same kind of function. I know that such and such, I believe that such and such, I suspect that such and such, I guess that such and such, I assume that such and such, I gather that such and such. Those expressions are not to report on your internal feelings. Those expressions are a way of signaling to your hearers what degree of confidence they can put on what follows that based on your say-so. So its belief is not the determining factor in this. Belief is a kind of it's an illusion in the way
Right.
people use it. Yeah.
Which was interesting because I've done this myself. I know you've experienced where people have asked you, "Do you believe in something?" And then we say, "I don't believe," and then they'll cut that statement, right? And then we'll say we have a knowing that goes beyond that. We have an inner knowing. Do I believe the sun is real? I don't believe it. I know it's there.
Mhm.
Do I believe that there's a life after death? I don't believe it. I know it. Knowing is through a direct experience,
That's right.
not through an external force that you've walked into and you're holding on to and grabbing onto, wishfully thinking it to be as such. So there's a foundation within a knowing belief. It's you're just grabbing on for straws for something to get you forward. But there's levels. I think there's hope, faith, belief, and then there's knowing, which is clear as crystal. There's no denying.
That's
Do I
right.
believe you're in front of me? I know you're in front of me.
When you say "I know," you're giving your guarantee.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? And if it's wrong, the person has a complaint against you if they come back. Whereas if you say "I believe," you're softening it, and
yeah.
you're not putting your whole guarantee on it.
Right. I wanted to ask you, is there something that you've concluded within your own knowing on what happens when we die? And
Yeah,
you've, interestingly enough, from what I gather, it's not just academic or research based. Your knowing has also come from your own experiences with higher consciousness, right? Do you mind like maybe sharing a little
yeah.
bit of your own epistemology spiritually and how you know what you know and why you are the way that you are based off of direct experiences?
Well, as you know, I was a professor of Greek philosophy. I love teaching Greek philosophy. Okay, and
Yes,
I want to
yes.
say that I am a skeptic in terms of my affiliation with Greek philosophy.
Mm,
And I'm saying that it may be startling to some of our listeners, but I got to say this, folks. Those people who call themselves skeptics about, they are ignoramuses who have no idea what they're talking about.
mm,
Many of them are entertainers, and they don't know what they're talking about.
mm,
When you hear somebody say, "I'm a skeptic about these near death
mm,
experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain." That person is a fool. I'm sorry. Because let me explain what a skeptic is. The skeptical movement arose after Aristotle codified logic. Okay. And so the skeptics, the founder of the movement was called Pyrrho, Pyrrho. And Pyrrho's thought was, well, Pyrrho knew logic very well. And if you think of logic as a system for generating conclusions from premises, see, what Pyrrho said is, well, we know how to do that. But what if we do ever ask every question we really bear down, but and apply this logic, but then in the end we refrain from drawing a conclusion? That's what it means.
mm,
Why? Not to just be, you know, persnickety, but rather because they found by just it doing that all the time, throwing up objections to everything
mm,
and not drawing a conclusion, then two things would happen. One, mind expansion. But number two, if you think of it geometrically and everybody's rushing this way to get to the conclusion, but your technique is to avoid a conclusion,
mm,
then you see things along the side pathways that everybody admits. That's what a skeptic is.
mm,
Run that knowledge by what the so-called skeptics who are usually entertainers who never
mm,
studied philosophy. Think about that. They say, "Oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's the chemistry of the brain."
mm,
That's stupidity.
mm,
Now, what the great skeptics like David Hume have said about their life course is, and I've experienced this myself, is that number one, it after a while of doing this, your mind is in a very good place. They called it calmness, and it's a very hard state to describe, but it's a great state. And so now back to your question, and that is that where have I reached as a skeptic on this? Where what I try to do is I throw up every objection to anything I hear to
mm,
try to knock it down.
mm.
Because if people, I just never understood these people who they have something out here they want to think is true, so they
Mm,
build this flimsy set of so-called reasons to reach it, and
mm,
that is self-deception. Somebody's trying to prove what they wish already. That's just self-deception, and they're always uncomfortable about it, right?
mm,
And so to me, the most fun method of proceeding is to try to knock everything down. So that's
mm,
what I've done all my time. I just wanted to try to figure out why not to think this is so. But
healthy skepticism, they call it, and not cynicism or crossing your eyes and legs if you could, but an openness.
it's,
But also, I also read a quote from you that, and I know Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer, talks about this too, where it's just kind of like you're in a courtroom and you're trying to justify a case. You're building a case of evidence of
yeah,
the afterlife. You're not looking for it. You're just taking the data and
I'm
seeing
just
the
trying to
foundation.
figure out what is. That's right.
Yeah.
And where I've come to it is I still realize that logical reasons why in 2023 it's not yet possible to draw a logical conclusion that there's an afterlife. That doesn't have to do with the problem of the afterlife itself, but rather with a certain incompleteness in our logical system, which was fostered on us by Aristotle. And what that Plato had been trying to figure out, how do you think logically about things that don't make sense?
Mm,
But Aristotle dropped that. And so the logic we have is predicated just on literally meaningful statements and propositions. Okay, now, um, so I understand the reason why it's not yet possible to draw the logical inference, but where I've come, I've just given up. See, I give up. I
mm,
can't think my way out of this. I knew all along it's not the oxygen deprivation to the brain, but the fact that it's not oxygen deprivation to the brain does not mean that it is life after death.
mm,
See, I just didn't know. But where I finally gotten to the point of giving up was just a purely psychological reason, really. It's that I can't think my way out of it.
mm,
And for example, I have a lot of friends, many of whom you know, who are medical doctors who had this experience themselves.
mm,
Eben Alexander is a friend of mine, Dr. Anthony Chicoria, Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll,
yeah.
and these astonishing medical doctors who have had near-death experiences or shared death experiences themselves. Dr. O'Driscoll talked with the dead wife of a patient,
Jeffrey Olson. Yeah.
Jeffrey Olson, while Jeffrey was being treated for almost dying from his car crash and losing his leg, and his wife was killed in the accident. So when Jeffrey Olson was brought into the hospital and they were, bringing him back, Jeff O'Driscoll, the ER doctor, was there talking with the wife of Jeff Olson, who had been killed in the wreck. And I give up because, see, if I had something happen to me, I mean, just, you're an exercise freak too. It's the thought of a broken foot. Oh my, think about that. I mean, that's a horror to me. Now, if heaven forbid something like that will happen to me, would I go to Anthony Chicoria, put my life in his hands?
Mm,
And he said, yeah, not only was my near death experience real, it was more real than this
mhm,
reality. So you see, I give up. I can't think my way out of it. And still, as counterintuitive as it seems to me to this day, I think if you're not raised in that kind of template,
mm,
it's harder and later. So, I mean, I just have to say that I cannot think of why there is not an afterlife. I gather that there is. And
yeah.
it's kind of frustrating to me because all my life I've been able to find an objection to everything.
Mm,
See, but here I'm kind of out of objections.
right.
I
There's
get
nothing to
afterlife.
debunk it with. And, I think they say our solutions cannot be solved from the level of the problems that originated. And
That's
so
right.
to our awareness of consciousness, if you're coming from a place of lower awareness or left brain awareness. We're talking about, nonlinear concepts, and it's just from a different part of your being that has to be able to see this. And I think the emergence of your mind and your heart to be able to recognize this. My
That's right.
theory is people are tuning into near death experiences, not just because of the turbulent times, but I think there's a degree of recall that people have, that there's a part of them that sees and remembers what you're talking about. And
That's
that's
right.
why they're tuning in. Otherwise, they wouldn't come here if there wasn't a familiarity. And that's what I find. But my biggest question that I have is people come up to me and they say, Jacob, I loved hearing your NDE, but you come from a very privileged place. You had this thing, I didn't. How could I gain or experience this? How could I? And they want the self induced experience. So, for people who don't have NDEs, who listen to an encounter, what have you seen some of the benefits from people who have been able to open themselves up to this? How has that helped maybe in their grief and their processing of life? What are some of the potential gains that people can
Oh,
have
yeah.
from listening to this?
Well, since Life After Life was published, and even before then, actually, because I had been lecturing on this for years before the book was published. But throughout this, I've always heard from people that, that I was grieving the loss of my husband or a dear loved one, and I was just in despair. And then I read this, and it gives me hope. And I'll tell you the truth, Jacob. I mean, that I mean, it's sad. I just hate to say this, but it is true that I did not write my book with any noble purpose in mind. I mean, I wrote it because it was fascinating and I thought it was something that should be investigated. But I wasn't thinking of this bringing inspiration to people. I really wasn't. But that was, to me, a wonderful kind of side effect, or,
The impact that
something
is,
I hadn't anticipated. But I've heard that, it is a very comforting thing to people to
yeah.
listen to these stories of when they're facing death themselves or the loss of a loved one.
Yeah. I mean, they've done a lot of data that they say belief works very well with grief. That even if this is all a farce, the fact, and it's not, but the fact that you have this box and that loved one isn't being seen underground, but the capacity for you to have this connection, this dynamic, this relationship continuing past the grave or past death, I
That's right.
think is helpful in one's grief journey.
Yeah.
Now, my last question is Life After Life had a lot of proof to it, but you've come out with your latest book where you've needed to add in proof of Life After Life,
Yeah.
which I don't know if it was necessary. That book had enough impact and proof to it, and I've proudly endorsed it. But could you talk a little bit about your latest book, which has just come out? And I know my
Yeah.
relative, who I'm sure is listening, has also had a near death experience as an infant several decades before mine. So you talk about synchronicities, and she loved this book too.
Oh, great.
But,
Thank you so
but
much.
yeah, yeah. But tell us a little bit about Proof of Life After Life. What's in it? How could people find that book, and
Yeah.
anything else close to your mind and heart at this time as well?
Okay. Well, thank you. Proof of Life After Life, which is with Paul Perry, and my man I've known for 33 years, and he's studied this too. And what it's all about is um, the these different phenomenal experiences that are quite common but are not very well known. And we talk about such astonishing things as terminal lucidity, where it's a very common phenomenon among people who treat the terminally ill. I've been involved in that a lot. That as people go down and down and down, and they're obtunded, and then, like, the family is just waiting around the bedside for the person to die. And all of a sudden, and if you haven't seen this, you're going to think Raymond Moody is crazy, which is probably partly true. But if you have,
More people are crazy about you than think that you're crazy. I know
well,
this.
because I used to be a comedian. I'm a comedian. I'm a little
Still
weird.
are, still are. Yeah.
But, it's people come back. I mean, I've seen it with my own patients that just before they die, even if they haven't spoken a word for weeks, and all the relatives are standing around just waiting for grandma to give up the ghost. And all of a sudden, grandma sits up and
Mm.
she has the energy of like a 30-year-old, and this light, I mean, not the from the sun or from a light bulb, but just a different kind of light comes from them. And they become very coherent. They often go around the room and give a message to everybody in the room. My uncle, who had this as he was going, not only talked to all his family members who were assembled, or immediate family assembled around the bed, but gave a message to everybody in the family. And then they just turn over and die. And I saw this guy. My kids are now 25 and 22, the young ones, and so this happened before my kids were born. But this man came all the way from Australia
Wow.
to tell me about this experience he had. His wife and he had been married a long time. They loved each other very much. And she was going downhill and downhill and downhill, had a terminal diagnosis.
Mm.
And he was in despair, but he said one he was getting ready to this gonna go to the store just for a couple of minutes. And so he went in to say goodnight to his wife and tell her he was going to the store. And he said he went in there and she was fine. And he was astonished, and he went and he had a long conversation with her. And
Wow.
he said, "Oh my God, she's going to get better." So he went to the store, and then, as you can imagine, when he came back, she was dead. And
Right.
I always wish that I could convey the look that man had on his face when he
Mm.
used to talk. He said, "Dr. Moody," he said, "it was almost as though she already had one foot on the other side." And that's what people appreciate. This is called terminal lucidity, but in
Yes.
our great grandparents' day, this was called fey, Fey. Everybody knew because people died at home back at
Mm.
that time that that just before people die, they have this state of heightened awareness that is,
Mm.
portends imminent death. And then when people started dying in the hospitals in the 30s, we lost track of that. But now it's reemerged because doctors have observed it, and we call it terminal lucidity. But whether you call it fey or terminal lucidity, it is an absolutely mind-bending thing. And I think just like that man from Australia told me, you can't shake the feeling when somebody is like that they are already in some other zone of reality in a
It, it,
more
it's
intense
similar
way.
in a way to an NDE where the brain functioning levels are very low, and yet your awareness is heightened. So that's why people get excited. They think they're turning the corner, but I
That's
think
right.
really there's a part of them that just connects in a higher level. They're able to like channel this in this body, and then they fade. I mean, this happens to a lot of people, and they just don't pay attention to it. I mean, I remember my aunt was my one of my biggest spiritual mentors. She would give me all the books and she give me all the lessons. But when she was dying, she spoke about her relatives, reaching out their hands, which is quite common, and on the other side. But she told me that if you look at a picture of a family, within the eyes of each family member, there's something that connects them. And this was an emphasis on her teachings on what's called the soul family, the spirit family. I thought nothing of it. I thought it was a nice lesson, but it was affirmative from what she stood for. And then a year or two later, I was connecting with a evidential medium, and she brought evidential data from my aunt, and she says, "Why is your aunt talking about pictures? Why is she emphasizing that?" And I know pictures was emphasizing her message on the power of the soul family, where something far beyond this lifetime connects us with those that we reincarnate with, and how she's still connected to us over there. And it's so true. We come from a soul group, soul family, and we're connected beyond this lifetime.
I just have to say from my experience in aging that is true. In 81 or 82, the spring, I had two wonderful sons who are now grown and on their own, 50 and 49, 50, 40, 51 and 49. And 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 so my wife, the last pregnancy had been difficult, so it wasn't wise for her to have another child. right? So, um, and I'd always wanted a girl, and and I'm so happy my sons came, right? And I always wanted a girl, and I was sitting on my porch swing in Charlottesville in the spring of '81 or '82, and I don't know where it came from, Jacob. It was like from really deep within, and I had the thought, been along powerful images with it. Wouldn't it be wonderful to adopt a Native American daughter? I
Mm.
have no idea where it came from. I just, but it was very heartfelt, and I
It was like
dwelt
a
on it.
calling, something you felt. Yeah.
I dwelt on it, and then I just let it go. I didn't send it up as a prayer. 19 years later, a woman that I had met in about 4 years before in New Mexico, a Native American woman. And I was at a lecture, and I was to be lecturing, but there was the previous lecturer was at the podium. I was sitting in the audience, and then the question came. Question time. There was a microphone in the middle aisle, so to ask your question, you had to go up and you know present yourself in public. Well, Native Americans, that's not their style. Okay, so right next to me was sitting this Native American woman who we later met. Her name is Christine. And my wife punched me and said, this woman was obviously wanting to ask a question. You could tell by her body language, but that's not Native. And I said, Cheryl just sort of punched me, and I just picked Christine up by the arm as anybody would do, and led her around and let her ask her question. Then we got to know each other. All right, now flash forward 4 years. Out of nowhere, the phone rings. I picked it up. It's Christine. How are you doing? Oh, we're doing fine. We just adopted a baby. She said, oh, I wish so much I had known you were looking, because I work on the reservation. I work in the hospital, and I'm the first person to know when we need an adoptive
Mm.
family.
Mm.
So I said, well, by all
Wow.
means. A couple of months later, your daughter is on her way. So I have a Native American daughter,
Wow. Wow.
and it's been one of the highlights of my life. When she
Mm.
was 9 years old, she just really loved to walk all the time. There was an old wooden bridge about a mile from where we live, and she would sit on the bridge and talk. So one day she said, I don't like this place. And it was obvious she meant the world.
Mm.
I was shocked. Huh? And she said, yeah. She said, yeah. She said, when you die, you just go up and you be with God, and He holds you up there till all the people you know while you're alive have died. And then He sends you back as another person. And I said, I was shocked. What makes you think so? She said, I just know, she said, in my mind. And she said, and I was with God, and He pointed you out to me. And
Wow.
He said, you got to go down to be His daughter. And I said, well,
Well,
how did you feel about that? And she said, oh, I didn't want to do it. She said, I wanted to stay with my God. But then she said, but
nothing personal on you. Yeah.
that's how he pushed me
Right.
down to be your daughter. And I
Wow.
said, well, are you glad you came anyway? She said, sure. So now I have this daughter who's learned the Blackfeet language from the internet, and it's you see the epigenetics. She's Native
The
American.
environmental release. Yeah. Yeah. But that's amazing how you saw this. You had this premonition,
Yeah.
happened a decade later, and also she connected to the same things that you connected to, and it was all clicking on all cylinders. And just
Okay.
again, how could your mind not explode and just want to?
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
Life itself is just so weird as soon as you start thinking about it.
Yeah. The last two questions before we depart is a macro and a micro question. On a micro level, we're friends. I know you. The one thing I hear about you
Mhm.
is he is the nicest man that I've ever
Oh,
spoken to.
oh my God.
He is the kindest man.
Oh,
He is so generous in listening and his time, and I feel like I'm talking to an angel. Anyone that has spoken to you, that's what they say. Now,
holy.
my question is, people have a perception of you where they have this legacy that they see you as,
Mhm.
but how have you been able to keep yourself grounded and just pure as who you are, because you see a lot of people who have success and impact, it kind of gets to them, and their external overtakes their internal. And
Mm.
my second question is, I know this is loaded, but if we were to leave viewers as some of the lessons from, our loved ones on the other side, or lessons from the afterlife, what do those in the hereafter want us to know about the here now? Which is a loaded question, but yeah.
Okay, let's see. About the first one, what has kept me from big headedness on this? I think it was looking through a telescope when I was 7 years old and realizing full well that as curious I was and as much I love to learn things, I'm not ever going to know much of anything. I read 185 academic books in the last year. As I know, because I started putting my books in a new shelf, and that suddenly I could count. And so 185 academic books in a
Man,
year. And I've always been that way. So it's curiosity that drives me, is one thing. And the other thing and that's probably one reason for the effect that you're describing, which I wasn't really aware of. But I mean, I would assume that if I appear not big headed, it's because I realize that our lot here in this world is ignorance, right? And that I'm comfortable with the fact that I'll never know much of anything.
wow.
Whereas I think astonishing to me, some scholars are the other way. They have to appear to know things.
So, in
But
other words, what we do know is limited, and what we don't know is unlimited, you would say,
there you
right?
go.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then another thing is that when I was a kid, 7 and 8, I had two life goals. One was to be an astronomer, and the other one was to be a comedian. And I have always been, according to people, funny. I was a professional comedian for a little while. I had to drop it because I was getting too many invitations um, to continue my psychiatry resident. I wanted to be a forensic psychiatrist to study murder, which was why I went to medical school, was to with the aim of being a forensic psychiatrist and studying homicide.
Mhm.
So I had a choice there between comedy and murder, and I chose murder. But but my sense of humor is a big part of me. I think,
Gotta
it's
laugh. Yeah.
oh yeah, and it's just humor is it's I think it's pretty connected with
Oh, sure.
thinking,
I
and
was interviewing like a big, I don't want to say who, but a big New York Times best-selling author a couple weeks ago, and I said hi so and so, and then he repeated what I say, and he says hi. Every word I was saying, he was repeated, and he was just hilarious. Like he said hi so and so, and he goes hi so and so, like, and everything, and it just cracked me up because you have to have a balance. If you're so intense about this, it's just going to lead to burn. You need to have a balance of. You watch the Dalai Lama or some of this; they're cracking up all the time. Laughter really elevates the soul. It really
oh
does.
my God, yeah, I have what others called an imaginary town, which settled on me in 1966. And to me, it's not imaginary because I don't make it up. It's more like it comes upon me. And all of a sudden, these characters just started talking, and I say to others what, and they laugh about it, and and um, and so I think because of my sense of humor is maybe one reason why I have not developed a big head on this. And
That's
another
important.
thing I think is because you know what my focus on is my kids and my grandchild and my wife.
Yeah.
That's it's and the older you get, I'm 79. See, it's a natural thing, as you know from your sociology
Mm.
work. As the older people get, they kind of turn, it's the narrow the circle on.
Yeah, get more discerning and selective. But it's incredible you talk about stars because I feel when you think of stars, it's like made of the same compository elements as like the human body in a sense. And we're looking at that and we're seeing a part in ourselves. And I was interviewing a guest and he was looking at a star and one of his tears just started to drop and someone turned to him and said, "Why are you crying?" He goes, "I remember being there and
Um,
living there."
yeah,
And I think that's a possibility, but also when we look at nature, it's a reflection of the expansiveness of who and what we are.
that's right. That's right. It's and to me, see, I am not religious, Jacob.
Mm,
It's I've never our kids. We never took our kids to any religious things,
mm,
and and because I mean, I've never had any religious background except just a little bit. I had an aunt who told me a few things like to celebrate the death of a person. She always
mm,
insisted, like on the first anniversary, we always get together when somebody in the family dies, or to thank the animal when you're eating. And those couple of little things I absorbed from childhood, but otherwise, I just religion has never been anywhere for me. As um, and we didn't take our kids to this, but and I'm happy that that happened, because I think that's one of the reasons why I have such a wonderful relationship with God and myself, because I talk to God every day, and He's never said a word to me about religion. And
You have your own internal dialogue with.
yeah, I mean, it's relationship.
Mm,
It's like I hear people, Raymond, do you believe that God exists?
mm,
I hear that question all the time, and I
right.
always say, absolutely not, because I, Raymond Moody, am a limited human being. Any
Mm,
belief that I could form about God would be bound to be mistaken, right? But also, listen to that sentence. Do you believe that God exists?
mm,
The emphasis is on the word exist.
mm,
That's putting the word exist above God.
mm,
Somebody who wants to know whether God exists. As a logician, I could take me about 30 minutes, but I could explain to you what the concept of existence is and even how to symbolize it. Okay?
mm,
But when it comes to God, I give up. To say that God exists doesn't make any more sense than to say that God doesn't exist.
mm,
What I say is, I have a relationship with God.
mm.
And
Yeah.
it's,
And
I
it's
have a relationship
personal.
with my kids. Do I wonder about whether they exist? No, it's my relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. Regarding relate last question, like regarding relationships to the afterlife, what could you say for people who maybe have questions, or rather, what have you concluded about life after life that
Okay.
people could
Yeah. And
hold on to?
I want to emphasize to the folks listening in that I'm not trying to persuade you, but and if somebody asks me what I have think about the afterlife, I'm happy to say, which is that I can't think my way out of it. I can't, I cannot put together all the things I've learned in any other way than to say that, to my utter astonishment, because it's still very counterintuitive to me, that I gather that there is an afterlife. I'm completely confident on that. And also, it's when I say in the book, Proof of Life After Life, which we just published,
Mm,
that's a strong statement. But I was a professor of logic. I understand what proof is and all the different meanings of proof. But over the years since I've been doing this for 5 decades now, repeatedly, very serious and fine and grounded people have
mm,
come to me and asked, Raymond, is there? Can you give any sort of proof that there's an
mm,
afterlife? And I immediately, 50 years ago, I started responding to people by talking about Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead and Principia Mathematica and Wittgenstein's. And people don't want to hear that.
mm,
What they mean by proof is not what I mean by it as a logic professor.
mm.
What most people want to know when they ask me if there's any sort of proof of this is a simple thing, and that is they're asking, Raymond, is it a rational thing to anticipate and expect that when we die, there's more to be written? And I say, absolutely yes. It's a completely rational thing to prepare and to anticipate and expect that when you die, you'll be going into another realm of existence.
We will go on. We will continue. we can only have life. And once you recognize there is no death, there can only be life. And
That's right.
I recommend all my viewers to check out Proof of Life After Life, as well as all of Dr. Raymond Moody's books and Paul Perry's books. Dr. Raymond Moody, a lifetime honor to have you on, to call you a friend,
Appreciate it.
and for all of your inspiration in my life and help to so many people who have benefited from, who have gained from your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob, and that goes right back to you. I mean, as soon as I met you, it seems like longer. I don't know time anymore, but you're just such a warm and sweet, heartfelt person. So, thank you again for this opportunity. Thanks for all the folks listening in too.
Well, that was a wonderful episode. Thank you for tuning in to episode 26 with Dr. Raymond Moody. A real honor to have him. He's a tremendous pioneer, and he really has broken through, on so many levels in research and evidence, of the continuity of life after death. So Raymond was a wonderful guest, a wonderful interview, filled with incredible data, and his mind just has so many gears to it. It's amazing. So those viewers who tuned into our interview, please make sure to share your comments in the comments section, as well as check out our other videos coming your way. Our next guest is Paul Perry, who co-authored the new book, Proof of Life After Life, with Dr. Moody. But thank you all for tuning in. It's a pleasure having you on my channel. We look forward to building a community, connecting to future videos coming your way. Thank you.